the Negro League teams always were scraping along financially. And in 1930, Wilkinson pulls the Monarchs out of the Negro National League and turns them into an exclusively barnstorming team. But the other very, very important thing he did, and many people believe that it probably saved black baseball, was he developed a portable lighting system that you could take on trucks from place to place. That enabled workers to see night games. And he invested everything he owned, took the financial risk. His wife had a antique store. He took everything out of that, put all his money, probably around $50,000 at the time, which is a pretty significant sum, to get the night baseball going, 1930.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, friends. It's Tim Hanlon. How are you? Thanks for joining me here on the podcast. And if you're new to Good Seats Still Available, we welcome you. And if you are a regular listener, we welcome you as well. Today, we are focused on our first conversation around the sport of baseball. Finally, yes, we get your emails and your tweets and your requests. And I think we're off to a fine start with this week's episode as we delve into the history of certain aspects of the Negro Leagues back in the earlier part of the 1900s. And our guest today, Bill Young, has authored a book on one of the teams that was a legacy standout in those early days in baseball history, called the Kansas City Monarchs. And he's written a tremendously interesting book about the founder of that team, who has a great tie to the sport of baseball before launching the Monarchs way back when in the Negro National League back in the 1920s, and certainly since then as well, by his posthumous induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame. His name was J.L. Wilkinson. The book that Bill Young has written, it's called J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs, Trailblazers in Black Baseball. A tremendous writing. Some very interesting stories that we're going to talk to Mr. Young about in a second. And I encourage you to listen to it all the way through, and you will learn a lot, as I did, and will continue to in the months to come. Before we get to our conversation with Bill Young, I do want to remind you that we are indeed, again, sponsored by and brought to you by our friends at Audible. As you know, hopefully you know by now, and if you haven't gone to our little website to find out more about it, shame on you. But Audible is the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles. Go ahead, count them. I'll wait. That you can choose from in just about every genre, whether that be business or romance or sci-fi, comedy, thrillers, nonfiction, you name it. Audible probably has it. All their titles from Audible play on any device just about that you have or you can throw at them, whether it be iPhone or Kindle, Android-based, more than 500 at last count, that will ensure that you can listen to your audiobooks anytime and anywhere. And as is referenced before, and if you haven't done yet already, please, by all means, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial of Audible's audiobooks. You must try it out for yourself. It's a wonderful service. Clearly, I don't recommend many things without believing in it, and this is one of those cases. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free book, your audiobook download, and your free 30-day free trial. Give it a try. I believe you will enjoy it. And if you don't, send me a note. Let me know that too, but I highly doubt it. And we want to thank Audible again for their sponsorship of this here little podcast. All right, let's, as we say, not waste any more time. Let us get to our very interesting and very intriguing conversation about the Kansas City Monarchs, their founder, J.L. Wilkinson, Hall of Famer, with our guest, Bill Young, here on the podcast. I guess perhaps the best place to start is, before we get into the thick of the content here, is perhaps a bit about how you became interested in the topic of the Monarchs, Mr. Wilkinson, Negro League baseball, all of it, enough to devote some time to write a really interesting tome about it.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I can pinpoint the beginning of the project. It was 2006. My wife and I were in Kansas City touring the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which everyone should see. Put that on your list to visit. It's worth a special trip to Kansas City, but absolutely a national treasure. And we were looking at the excellent exhibit about the history of African Americans in baseball, and came upon a picture of the 1924 Negro Leagues World Series, which was the first World Series for black baseball. And they had a picture of one of the two teams in the series, the Kansas City Monarchs, all the players lined up, and on the end is this white guy. And I immediately thought, well, what is a white man doing with the black Kansas City Monarchs? His name I found was J.L. Wilkinson. He was the founder and owner of the Monarchs. And as I left the exhibit, I thought, boy, it would be interesting to find out more about him. And as we left, standing in the foyer there at the museum is a very distinguished-looking older black gentleman. It's Buck O'Neill, who is one of the most famous Monarchs for sure.
Certainly.
And he spent a lot of time at the museum. He was one of the founders of the museum, and I'm looking at a picture of him signing his autobiography. That's one of my most treasured baseball possessions. So that got me interested, and I picked up his autobiography, and I thought, well, Buck O'Neill also, he's, as a young boy in 1924, he's looking at that picture in the Chicago Defender African American Weekly and says, who's that white guy? and he came to know him very well. So that was the genesis of the project. I was working on another book on John Tortoise Myers, one of the first Native Americans to star in Major League Baseball. So I had to finish that before I could get going on the Wilkinson and Monarchs project. But as I did, first of all, I thought, has anybody done a biography of Wilkinson? No, nobody's had done a biography of Wilkinson. There have been some work on the Monarchs and some excellent histories of black baseball. That was the place to start. Then I got in contact with Wilkinson's descendants, his three grandchildren, one who lives in St. Joseph, and Ed Catron. Went over and talked to Ed, and he brought in his two cousins, and we had a delightful conversation. And they shared their memories of JL and his wife Bessie, and that really got me going and interested. And then there were back in the 1970s, a researcher named Janet Bruce recorded interviews with a lot of the Monarchs players, and those are available at the Missouri Historical Society for me. Then I contacted the National Baseball Hall of Fame. They're great. They are really great. They scanned their entire Wilkinson file, sent it off to me, helped me with pictures. One of the things that Ed Catron told me is that when J.L. Wilkinson died in 1964, they threw away all the Monarchs files that he had in his office, unfortunately. Wow. But he had a partner named Tom Baird, and Tom Baird's files are available at the University of Kansas Research Library in Lawrence. So my wife and I were able to go there and dig through those records and get a lot of great information. But most important, in addition to lots of other primary research, was the white newspapers, the white dailies, in this case the Kansas City Star in Kansas City, really didn't cover Negro Leagues very much. Every once in a while there'd be an article, but not very much. But the African American weeklies gave a lot of coverage to Negro Leagues teams. In this case, the Kansas City Call, which serendipitously began publication 1919. The Monarchs were founded in 1920, and they continue to publish today, the Kansas City Call weekly paper. And so I spent many days with a microfilm of the Kansas City Call, and that allows you to tell the narrative of the Monarchs and Wilkinson. So
So
that's the story of how it got going and the research I did.
So the story then is really, the narrative is really about Wilkinson the man, and I guess right. the ultimate sort of expression of what he was about professionally during right. his time with the Kansas City Monarchs. But I guess before right. the Monarchs came into place, I mean, he was kind of like the original kind of barnstormer type, right? Almost along the lines of an Abe Saperstein or these other types that were trying to kind of keep baseball kind of floating around.
And ironically, he gave Abe Saperstein his start later. He was one of the first most successful baseball entrepreneurs, promoters, who just is kind of lost in the mist of baseball history. So I was delighted to be able to shine a spotlight on him. So just a quick background on J.L. Wilkinson. He was born in Iowa, grew up in Iowa. His father was at one point president of a college, and it's obvious that they raised him to have respect and tolerance for people of all backgrounds and all races. He played baseball, but he broke his wrist and wasn't able to continue, and got into the business side. And his first team was a women's team, ironically enough. And at that point, he realized right from his first go with the women's team in 1908 that if you're going to succeed in anything, and if you're going to succeed in baseball, you got to have talent. So he scoured the Midwest and got the best women players available. You have to have first-rate talent to succeed, but you also need to promote. So he traveled with the women's team, and he brought along a wrestler. And so they go into these small towns. That was the other thing he kind of pioneered, this notion that you make money through barnstorming in small towns, kind of like the Walmart philosophy. And he brought along a wrestler, and so after the game, the wrestler would challenge the strongest young man in the town to a wrestling match. And the other thing he did was, so you got to treat your players well. And boy, any Monarch that talks about Wilkinson, the first thing they say is how well he treated his players. And that began with his women's team. So he gets a Pullman train car, and that he can take the players in, and he develops, this is going to be important later in this story, a portable ballpark with portable seats and portable canvas, so he can set up a ball field anywhere. So the guy is already off to a good start.
Well, it almost feels it almost feels like there's sort of elements of sort of a small time kind of circus element to it. No,
you got it. And whenever there was a circus or a fair in town, he would bring his team in to piggyback to that.
All right, but before we get off the women's team for a second, there is some speculation around. I don't know how much you devote to it in your book, but were they all women on the team?
No. His team, they would have a few guys that would usually dress in women's clothes or women's uniforms, and they were called bloomer girls back then because of this loose-fitting kind of skirt type or pants type thing that they would wear. But probably the most famous ball player to begin his career in a women's team was Rogers Hornsby, the great St. Louis Cardinal. He began in Texas, I think it was, playing for women's teams. So that was not uncommon.
Okay, but last thing on this one is, do you think the crowd was in on the joke, or was it truly a deceptive attempt to?
I think the crowd was in on the joke. I don't know for sure, but I think so. But there's been some good work by women scholars on bloomers girls sports in the early part of the 20th century. They're very popular.
That's a fun little story, and you can tell if it's ever a movie, it's an interesting element for sure. If so,
yeah, definitely.
But so he learned quite a bit of sort of the promotional flair. How did that sort of how did he evolve from that then?
Well, his next project was in 1912. By this time, very popular ethnic teams, black teams, Native American teams, even some Hawaiian teams, Cuban teams were barnstorming through the Midwest and around the country. So what he would do is take something and take it a next step. And for him, that meant I'm going to have a team that has a multiplicity of ethnicities represented. I'm going to call it the All Nations team. Began in 1912, and just tell you about two players on that team. One of whom is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. That's Jose Mendez, a Cuban, and the other is John Donaldson, a left-handed pitcher from Missouri, African American. 6,000 career strikeouts, for example. John McGraw said he would have paid $50,000 if he could have had a black player. That's an interesting story with John McGraw and trying to sneak in black players onto his team.
Sure.
But anyway, John Donaldson, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And there's something called the Donaldson Network online, run by a guy named Peter Gorton, which is trying to promote John Donaldson for the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He certainly deserved to be in players of that caliber. So again, he recruits the best. They play against some of the traveling black teams, and one of them is a team out of Chicago, which I'm not sure it was then, becomes the Chicago American Giants, owned, run by Rube Foster.
Sure. So
Wilkinson begins an association with Rube Foster that's going to become very important. So the one thing I would say about the All Nations team is that they're playing, 1912 through 1918. Some of the players get drafted into World War I, so it kind of fades, but it continues in various forms for quite some years. But they're demonstrating in 1912 to 1918 that black and white and other ethnicities can play together on the same team quite successfully, and that they can play at the highest caliber of the sport. And this is a time, 1915, Birth of All Nations, D.W. Griffith's film that with these ugly, monstrous stereotypes of black men is popular. So
sure, in the First
World War, what Wilkinson did in his career had a great impact on race relations. It set the stage, as we'll see later, for the integration of baseball with Jackie Robinson, who played for the Monarchs before he was signed by Branch Rickey. But J.L. Wilkinson is a racial reformer without really claiming that label. He's not an out front civil rights leader, never was. But what he's doing in his with his teams, with his players, with the people who work for him, is he's establishing a model of races working together, respecting one another. Really important figure.
Do you think that was largely for a noble pursuit of this ideal, or do you think it was more promotional and interesting and intriguing in nature, or some combination of those two things?
I would like to say it's not primarily in pursuit of a noble ideal any more than Branch Rickey's signing of Jackie Robinson was. That was business, and Branch Rickey said it was. And for Wilkinson wanted to put the best product he could on the field. He's a baseball owner, promoter, a president, general manager. He wants a product that's going to make money. His family believes that he would have gone into the white major leagues if he'd had the money, but he didn't. So he didn't pursue the Monarchs and black baseball as an ideal. He did it primarily because he knew he could succeed with it. But to succeed, he had to treat his people well, and he had to confront discrimination. So he was primarily a businessman, I'd say.
Well, it sounds like that business approach, though, kind of got wrecked by, like a lot of things, the advent of the advent of the First World War. Yeah,
and right. In that case, so in 1919, the worst race riots break out all across the country, and what's Wilkinson's response? Wilkinson's response is to call upon his friend Casey Stengel from Kansas City, who's in the major leagues, and to get a exhibition game with some black players and playing some major league players. So I think he had in mind, although he was never public and he never really talked much about it, he had in mind doing things that helped with racial reconciliation. I mean, that was not his primary objective, but it certainly was, I think, important to him. But it's 1920 that the Negro Leagues get started, and I know you want to talk about that.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, I guess what I'm really intrigued with is sort of how does Wilkinson go from sort of the, I guess, freer hand and promotional latitude, shall we say, of barnstorming into, I guess, the beginnings of something a little bit more formal and regulated, right. I guess, and more, combined with other entities, in a competition setting.
Right. Once again, Wilkinson took advantage of something that was getting started. And in this case, it was Rube Foster, who had tried hard to get white owners to accept blacks onto their teams. He tried hard to integrate baseball. And, this Jim Crow era, separate segregation is well entrenched. So that's not working. So Rube Foster says, we're going to make black baseball work. Rube Foster is a genius. And so Wilkinson gets in line, and they form the Negro National League in 1920. The organizational meeting's in Kansas City, and although Wilkinson is behind the scenes primarily, the organizational meeting is in his town. So he's the only white owner in the Negro Leagues, and they had to. Rube Foster had to be convinced, but by that point he was pretty committed to having black institutions owned and run by blacks for blacks, and so he had to be convinced that Wilkinson was that they should go along with Wilkinson and the Monarchs, and the reason they did was because Wilkinson had already by 1920 established himself he'd moved from Des Moines to Kansas City about 1918, I think, and or a little earlier than that. And he had established himself in the black community. He'd already had a couple of teams. He had the All Nations team, and so he proposes the Monarchs. They're accepted into the Negro National League 1920, and it gets going, and it succeeds almost immediately as a black institution with this white guy. And for a while, he's the only really significant white person involved with the Negro National League.
The relationship between Rube and JL was probably more than business then, right? I guess they both sort of saw similar things.
His family recalls a friendship. I wouldn't say they were close friends, not buddies, but certainly very close business associates. And Foster, who's every bit as bright as Wilkinson, realizes very quickly that this guy is good. He knows how to succeed. He knows how to put a quality baseball product on the field, and so they get along very well. And you probably know the tragic story of Rube Foster. He kind of mentally disintegrated, and Wilkinson, I think, gave a eulogy for him. So yeah, they were close.
Well, and obviously Foster running the Chicago American Giants, it seemed to be a quite almost an immediate rivalry, at least on the field.
Yeah, it was like the Cubs and the Cardinals, the Yankee. Choose your rival. That's the one that's first and foremost on my mind. But yeah, they. I'll give you an example. They're playing Newt Allen is the Monarchs shortstop, and Dave Malarcher, I think it is, from the Chicago American Giants, slides hard. You could do that then in second base and really spikes him badly. So the next time Malarcher is coming into second base, Allen drills him in the forehead and puts him out for cold for quite a while. That's the kind of thing that went on between the American Giants and the Monarchs. But here's Wilkinson's response. He really gets upset with his players for the on-field fighting. He said I want you to play hard. I want you to play aggressively, competitively, but I don't want this brawling. So he was very much in favor of clean play, and this is something that kind of haunted the Negro Leagues, is this kind of reputation that these guys are brawlers, and kind of that stereotype of that was common. So yes, they were intense competitors, and had some really rough games, but Wilkinson did what he could to limit that.
Well, it's clear though that the games were clearly passionate. There was a real interest in succeeding, and obviously the quality of play.
What I would say about black baseball throughout, before the Negro Leagues and all the way through the Negro Leagues, and that they continue up into the 1950s, even almost to the 1960s. Of course, the integration of the major leagues really is the death knell for Negro League baseball. But it's spirited play, it's fun play, it's aggressive play. But you can tell these guys are having a great time out there. And of course, the white responses to that, well, these guys are showboating. They are they're not taking the game seriously. Responses like that, but that's one of the things that, of course, Jackie Robinson brought into Major League Baseball, wasn't it? That exciting, spirited, high-intensity play.
Well, I suspect that we'll get a lot more deep into Negro League Baseball as our fledgling podcast keeps going. But I'd love to get maybe your initial take. I mean, at the time, right? It seems to me, certainly in hindsight, right? And I'm an amateur historian for sure. But that the quality of play was not only as good as the established baseball world, but in many cases superior, both individually as well as team effort, if given the chance to prove it.
You're absolutely right, and we have evidence for this. As soon as the Negro League started in 1920, after the regular season ended, and there were games against white major leaguers. Monarchs played Babe Ruth and a group of major leaguers in 1921 for the first time, and this continues all through the history of Negro Leagues baseball, that there are exhibition games. A couple of the most famous, 1934, Dizzy and his Dean and his brother Paul. After the famous Gas House Gang of the 1934 World Series, immediately after that World Series, they go on a tour with the Monarchs. And what the major leaguer says, one is these guys are as good as, in some cases, better than us. Dizzy Dean called Satchel Paige the best pitcher he'd ever seen. He said if Satchel and I were on the same team, we would have the pennant won by the 4th of July, and we'd go fishing until the World Series. Every major league player, Bob Feller, before and after World War II, was heavily involved in barnstorming with the Monarchs and other Negro Leagues teams. Joe DiMaggio didn't really barnstorm very much, but they all said these guys should be in the major leagues, talent-wise. Not all of them, but certainly the best players of the Negro Leagues were just as good as the best players of the major league. So it's not speculation. It's not a hypothesis. It's demonstrated that the only thing keeping blacks out of so-called organized baseball was racial discrimination.
Would it be fair to say that the Monarchs themselves during the Negro National League's existence were the best team, or most dominant, or most competitive, or one of them?
Rube Foster and the American Giants would contest that, but The Monarchs were in the first. There were two Negro National Leagues. So there was one that ran from 1920 to 31, and American Giants and Monarchs were clearly the two best teams in the first Negro National League, and then there was the Eastern Color League that began a few years after the Negro National League, and over there, best teams were the Hilldale Daisies of near Philadelphia, and the Homestead Grays near Washington D.C. Probably the two best teams, although you'd get some. So there were teams, there were players. The Kansas City Monarchs could have been in the major leagues. The Homestead Grays could have been in the major leagues with the talent they had. Some may dispute that the teams, but I don't know. I think it's pretty well established.
Well, they won the whole thing, not only the Negro National League title, but also in 24 the first, I guess. The first
right? Negro National League's World Series, right?
So obviously a dominant performance that year, but obviously not a surprise, frankly. But I'm really intrigued by the fact that Rube Foster was not only the head of the Chicago American Giants, but he was also a head of the league. That needs to be said for sure. He was the president of the Negro National League from 1920 until he had his mental breakdown. Amazingly successful guy. He doesn't get the credit he deserves. He is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but he's right up there with what? Who would you identify as the best baseball executives in the history of white baseball? Well, he's right up there with them, I think. Well, I'm really intrigued with sort of the dynamic, though, between him and Wilkinson, given that they both own separate teams and operate them. And then Rube is obviously, head of the league itself.
Very competitive. And Rube Foster kind of tried to throw his weight around because he was both president and owner of the American Giants and give them some advantage. And Wilkinson took exception to that. Everybody says Wilkinson was a mild-mannered guy, never really showed his temper very much, but he could stand up for his guys.
Well, but in particular, though, something interesting happened after the Monarchs won their first combined world championship. Foster changed the rules the next year.
What are you?
So
give me a hint there. What are you?
Fair enough. I'm sorry. I'm guilty of doing of homework for this. I apologize. My understanding is that they changed the league schedule the following year to a kind of a split season approach.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Yep. And
to his advantage, right? Obviously.
It didn't seem to stop. Well, okay, so let's obviously the Negro National League was. The
one thing I want to say about the 24 World Series is that baseball historians say that that 24 series is among the best two or three World Series, Major Leagues, or any Negro Leagues ever. 9 games, 5-4 with one tie. Jose Mendez, the Monarchs manager and pitcher, kind of drags himself out of a sickbed to pitch the final game. Just outstanding baseball. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So what ended the party, so to speak? Obviously the league was obviously doing well, certainly on the field and performing.
Right.
Why did it
what ended
demise?
The Negro National League was the Great Depression. That made people didn't have discretionary income to go to games. Both in the Major League had enough history and money to keep going, but the Negro League teams always were scraping along financially. And in 1930, Wilkinson pulls the Monarchs out of the Negro National League and turns them into an exclusively barnstorming team. But the other very, very important thing he did, and many people believe that it probably saved black baseball, was he developed a portable lighting system that you could take on trucks from place to place that enabled workers to see night games and really saves. And he invested everything he owned, took the financial risk. His wife had a antique store. He took everything out of that, put all his money, probably around $50,000 at the time, which is a pretty significant sum, to get the night baseball going, 1930. The response from most in the major leagues is that this is a stunt. It will never work. Nobody wants to see baseball at night. But 5 years later, the major leagues, of course, are playing night baseball. So innovator again, entrepreneur, risk taker, but pretty much saved black baseball for sure during the Depression. So through the Depression, he keeps the Monarchs out of any league. He says it's not because I don't want to be part of a league. It's just that it's not financially viable. So 1937, he helps organize the Negro American League, which was very successful. It continued into the 1950s with teams like the Birmingham Black Barons that gave a start to a guy named Willie Mays. Again, the Chicago American Giants, the Monarchs, Memphis Red Sox, and then a controversial team you probably heard. They were first known as the Ethiopian Clowns, and then they became the Indianapolis Clowns.
Sure.
And they were known for putting on kind of minstrel. No, that's not the right word. They're putting on shows that kind of, in the minds of some people, kind of played to the stereotypes of whites toward black ball players.
Absolutely.
So that's controversial. We'll say Wilkinson sees that the clowns are popular. People coming out to see them, both white and black fans coming out to see them. They're putting on a good show, yes, but they're also playing great baseball. So he has the Monarchs in a lot of series with the clowns very, very, very successfully. And I think maybe the thinking has now changed a little bit about that. These guys yes, they were putting on a show, but they were talented entertainers as well as talented ball players.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. I'm just really curious, though, as to what's in Wilkinson's head when he decides that he wants to go back into a professional circuit again. How instrumental was he in the formation of the Negro American League or was he just a willing participant to an organization started or contrived by others?
One of the things that's hard to, in part because all his records are gone, and also because he was a really behind-the-scenes guy. He didn't like to be out front in anything. For the example, the Monarchs, when they had the big opening day parade for the Monarchs, he never rode in the car. He put his black business manager Quincy Gilmore kind of out front, and was behind the scenes. And in the formation of the first Negro National League, although he obviously played a very central role, it's kind of really hard to document that in the records. The same with the Negro American League, I think. He certainly, without him, I doubt it would have gotten started. But it's hard to exactly, what did he exactly do other than lend his, by this point, by 1937, his, three-decade history of success in baseball promotion. He lends his name, he lends his credibility, but he's not out there front. He's not holding the news conferences. He's not being interviewed on ESPN, if there were such a thing at the time. So interesting in terms of the role he played. Obviously important, but never beating his own drum for sure.
Yeah, he strikes me as maybe a predecessor version of somebody, say, like a Lamar Hunt, somebody who we've explored over the years.
Yeah.
Right. Very, very, very a quiet, gentle giant, but behind the scenes, obviously, hugely influential and important.
That's a good comparison. Yeah, very definitely.
Well,
he's every bit as much a baseball promoter and willing to use gimmicks as Charlie Finley, but Charlie Finley without all the pizzazz.
Yeah, it almost seems like Wilkinson kind of understood the idea of entertainment and quote unquote gimmickry.
Yes, he did.
But
yes, he did.
Also recognized too that was more of perhaps a means to an end versus being an end in and of itself. Yeah,
I think we need to get to Satchel Paige and Jackie Robinson. They're two, the three most well-known Monarchs. Jackie Robinson only played a couple months, but Satchel Paige played a long time with the Monarchs. Buck O'Neill, those three probably the most famous Monarchs.
Well, so let's talk about that then. So Wilkinson, obviously very well known for, in either directly or indirectly, bringing in such great talent, obviously, as the ages then showed over time.
Yep.
But do you want to maybe circle around how Robinson got into the family and how these others sort of became part of, the mix? Can
I start briefly with Satchel Paige? He comes first in that chronology.
Please, certainly, go right ahead.
1938. Satchel Paige has already been in pro baseball he started in 1926. Already had a very successful 12-year career. Well known for jumping from team to team, ignoring contracts, taking the best deal or wherever it was. And by 1938, Wilkinson and the Monarchs had taken advantage of that. They had rented Satchel Paige from other teams to play for the Monarchs, and particularly in exhibition games. And so in 1938, Satchel is signed with the Newark Eagles, and one of the most interesting baseball executives, Effa Manley. You ever heard of her? The only woman in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, I think, to present. She and her husband were the owners of the Newark Eagles. They had purchased Satchel Paige's contract. Satchel Paige ignored it. He went to Mexico. His arm went dead. Maybe a rotator cuff injury. We're really not sure. Satchel says that he's run out of special oil that he was given by the Sioux Indians when he was playing for a team in North Dakota, that they would rub on his arm after every game. He'd run out of it, and that was probably why his arm went dead. Anyway, his arm's dead. Nobody wants him. Wilkinson calls him up and says, we'll take you, Satchel. Would you want to play for us? Satchel comes to the Monarchs. First couple of years, he plays on a traveling team. The Monarchs have their main team in Kansas City, and then they have an exclusively traveling team so he gets the best of both worlds, the barnstorming and the league affiliation. And Wilkinson, after a very short time, recognizes this guy's popularity has not decreased. People want to see Satchel Paige, so he changes the name from the Kansas City Travelers or Kansas City Traveling Team to the to the Satchel Paige All-Stars, and there it begins. To make a long story very short, Satchel Paige considered J.L. Wilkinson the person who saved his career. They maintained a very close friendship. Paige considered him his mentor all the way for the rest of Wilkinson's life. Oh wow, somebody could write a book just on Paige and Wilkinson, their association for sure. But so Satchel ends up going to the major leagues. Bill Veeck, another great baseball promoter, signs him. And 1971, Satchel goes into the Hall of Fame. Ted Williams, you may know, played an important role in that. But they put Satchel as the first Negro Leagues player, first Negro Leagues player to go into the Hall of Fame. They're going to put a special wing, not in the hall, not where the other plaques are, but in another wing. And Satchel says, Major League Baseball is turning me from a second-class citizen into a second-class immortal. Example of his humor. So that's Satchel Paige. But wow, what a guy!
Well, certainly,
amazing.
And that wasn't the last of it.
Wilkinson recognizes the potential there. Nobody else does. Nobody else would. Satchel Paige's career would have been over in 1938 had it not been for J.L. Wilkinson. And that. You want to go to Robinson, or
I was going to say. I mean, that's clearly not the only sort of talent that he discovered, sort of in the rough out there, right? So let's talk about Robinson. Obviously, a gargantuan figure, right? Jackie Robinson is a nationally known football player with the UCLA. He also played track, football, track, baseball, and basketball. Football is clearly and track are his best sports. He's drafted into the Army. He is commissioned as a second lieutenant. He famously refuses to move to the back of the bus before Rosa Parks, an Army bus. He's court-martialed. He's found innocent, and he's discharged from the Army honorably in November 1944. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He hasn't finished his UCLA degree. He doesn't have a college degree. What's he going to do? So he hears from a Monarchs player. We're not exactly sure. May have been Hilton Smith, a really excellent, probably just as good or better pitcher than Satchel Paige. He contacts the Monarchs in Wilkinson, and they sign him to play for the Monarchs in the summer of 1945. And Jackie, who's in some ways not the best player on the Monarchs for sure. You got Willard Brown, for example, a great home run hitter. You got Hilton Smith, a great pitcher. You have Satchel Paige, all probably better players in a sense than Jackie Robinson. What does Jackie Robinson have? He has smarts. He certainly has character. And so when Branch Rickey is looking for the first black to sign, Wendell Smith, who is an important guy, also kind of lost in the mists of baseball history, a journalist, wrote for the various black newspapers, and he's the one who recommends Robinson to Branch Rickey, and Branch Rickey interviews him, clearly sees this is the guy I want. So what does Branch Rickey do? He asks Jackie Robinson, do you have a contract with the Monarchs? And Jackie says, well, not really, no. Well, what the custom in the Negro Leagues was your letter. When you receive a letter from the team, that's the agreement. You don't have a formally signed contract at that point for the most part. So, and technically, right, he doesn't have a contract. So Rickey says, okay, fine, we'll take you. So the Monarchs are never paid anything for Jackie Robinson. Kind of, Branch Rickey has known him for many things, but he was being someone who was willing to pay money for anything was not one of them. One of his nicknames was El Cheapo. So the response of the Monarchs is, this is great. Jackie Robinson deserves an opportunity to play Major League Baseball along with a number of other Negro leaguers. So Wilkinson and his partner, who we really haven't talked about, Tom Baird,
get behind the signing of Robinson. Kind of quietly, they say, don't you think you should you should pay something for his contract? They for sure think he's under contract with the Monarchs. So, but Jackie Robinson, he had played on an integrated college, one of the top college programs in the country. He didn't take well to the Jim Crow attitude that he experienced traveling with the Monarchs, particularly in the South. And there are a couple famous stories. One is when they stopped for gas, the Monarchs stopped for gas, and Robinson goes to use the restroom, and the owner of the gas station says, no blacks allowed in the restrooms. And so he says, well, we're not buying gas here. And the owner says, well, okay, you can use the restroom, but don't stay very long. And so from that point on, the Monarchs never, and they had been stopping at stations which were segregated. And they never buy gas at a station that doesn't allow them to use the facilities again. But Robinson had a kind of rocky relationship with the Monarch, not with Wilkinson. He got along very well with Wilkinson, but he didn't really like playing. He didn't like the travel schedule, and so he was ready to leave that late summer of 1945 when the opportunity to sign with Ricky came along. But the conclusion here is that without Wilkinson signing Robinson, he has no baseball career. Wilkinson's instrumental in the Jackie Robinson story, but everybody knows Branch Rickey, knows the Jackie Robinson story, but who knows the role played by the Monarchs and especially J.L. Wilkinson.
Well, it seems that Wilkinson and the Monarchs became pretty well known for being a pipeline of African American talent, right?
Oh, yes. They sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro Leagues team, for sure.
Well, you had Robinson.
One of the most well known, Ernie Banks, Cool Papa Bell. A lot of people have heard about Cool Papa, one of the fastest runners in baseball history. He was managing the Monarchs travel team in what are we, about the 1950, I guess, or late 40s. And he says to Tom Barrett, who's taken over the team from Wilkinson by this point, there's this guy down in, this guy in Dallas that we should take a look at. And they say, we don't need any more shortstops. But Cool Papa says, look at him. So Buck O'Neill, who's managing the Monarchs, goes down to Dallas, and without even seeing Banks play with it, just on reputation, they signed Banks to the Monarchs. So Ernie Banks, Elston Howard, just two of the greats who went to the
Hank Thompson.
Elston Howard, the first black New York Yankee.
Sure, and Hank Thompson. I mean, Willard Brown. You mentioned. Okay, well,
sure.
It seems to me that if anything could define success in the professional Negro leagues, the Monarchs and Wilkinson were doing it. Why then does he sell the team near the end of the decade?
Good question.
40. I guess we're talking 1948 is when he.
1948, he sold his interest in the team. It was mostly because of health problems. His eyesight was almost gone by 1948. He really couldn't read, couldn't see very well at all. He'd been in a couple of bad car accidents with Monarchs players, and he just wasn't up to it. So his co-owner, partner, Tom Barrett, goes all the way back to the beginning of the Monarchs, but talk about somebody who was really behind the scenes. The players didn't even know he was associated with the team for years and years. So Wilkinson sells his interest in the Monarchs to Tom Barrett, but he's a smart business guy. He retains the rights to the traveling team, and he negotiates. He will get basically half of any amount over, I think, $1,000 that a major league team or any white team pays for a Monarchs players' contracts. By this time, all the Monarchs have very formal contracts. They've learned their lesson. So he makes a good bit of money on the Monarchs after he sells, and his son is traveling with the traveling team when the call goes out to Satchel Paige from the Cleveland Indians to sign with the Indians. So he gets Bill Veeck, in contrast to Branch Rickey, was willing to pay for the contracts of black players that he signed, including Larry Doby. Who's the first black to go into the American League. So Wilkinson's out by 48. The Monarchs continue. Frankly, Baird uses them pretty much as a pipeline to sell players to the white teams, white major leagues and minor leagues. But there's an effort made to kind of fold the Negro leagues into the organized baseball, make them a part of the structure of white organized baseball, rebuffed. The attitude of white baseball magnates toward the Negro leagues kind of throughout is that these are rackets. These are run by unscrupulous men, numbers racketeers, gamblers, and they're not really businesses. And we will not dignify them with recognizing them. We'll take their best players and turn them into white, major or minor leaguers. But we don't want their teams they're sullied. It's clearly a racist perspective that continues well into the 40s, into the 50s. The Negro American League hangs on for a while. But one by one, the teams fade. The Monarchs kind of fade gradually away. They're bought by a guy named Ted Raspberry, Grand Rapids, Michigan. They can't make payroll. Guys just kind of leave the team. And so it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, but by the early 60s, the Monarchs are no more.
Well, this is also part of it's against a backdrop of the steady integration of the major leagues, finally.
Oh,
right?
gosh, yes.
Yeah,
right,
so
yeah.
in essence, the existence or the need
particularly the
for
Monarchs, they're in Kansas City. And who comes into Kansas City? The Athletics, right? Philadelphia Athletics are sold, become the Kansas City Athletics. And who's the owner? Eventually Charlie Finley, right? So,
yep.
So the Monarchs, they have never owned their own ballpark. Throughout all the years of their existence, they have to rent the white minor league ballpark. And by the 40s, it's a New York Yankee minor league team, the Kansas City Blues. And so I found in Tom Baird's records, they're charging the Monarchs, for cleaning the bathrooms and for, all sorts of stuff, and it just squeezing them to the point that they're no longer financially viable. And I have in the book a picture of after Robinson signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers. There's a special train to take people from Kansas City to St. Louis to see Robinson when the Dodgers are playing the Cardinals, and that's just a very clear indication what's happening is that black fans they're following Robinson and the other blacks that are in the major leagues, and the interest level in the Negro leagues is fading. They're not getting any support from white baseball. So they're doomed.
So what of Wilkinson then during that time? He obviously was probably becoming more disengaged, if not even even involved anymore. What did he do? Where did he go? What eventually?
Where did he end up? Yeah. Well, he stays in Kansas City. He, as I mentioned, his wife Bessie is she's a delightful person in her own right. Very successful business owner of antique shops, and one of the things is she turned Satchel Paige on to to collecting antiques. So imagine what you know about Satchel Paige as a connoisseur of fine antiques, so he helps out. He kind of helps out Bessie with the antique shop. His grandkids remember him as a delightful grandfather who doted on his grandchildren, but they also remember he's pretty much confined to his home at this point. So who drops by? Satchel Paige a lot. Jackie Robinson, interestingly enough, paid attention to Wilkinson in those later years. And John Donaldson was probably maybe his closest friend. And his grandson, Ed Catron, remembers that John Donaldson, who signed on as one of the first scouts, he was with the White Sox as one of the first African-American scouts, and quit when they refused to sign Willie Mays. I think it was, Willie Mays. Ed Catron remembers John Donaldson at his grandfather's funeral with tears running down his face, standing there at the gravesite. Just emblematic of, and John Donaldson goes all the way back to All Nations days and then played for the Monarchs. Emblematic of the kind of friendship relationship that this largely humble guy had with his players. Truly an incredible story, and I consider it a real privilege to be able to bring him more to light. His story certainly deserves to be told. The final thing I want to make sure we get included is that, of course, in 2006, after a study of African Americans in baseball, Wilkinson is one of a few Negro Leagues owners who are inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So his contributions have been recognized by those who know.
Why do you think it took nearly 40 years since his passing to finally achieve that? Was it just simply a knowledge or lack thereof of his influence and story?
Yeah, well, in my epilogue in the book, I tell the story of how African Americans, the relationship between African Americans and the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and to put it kindly, it's a checkered story. Satchel Paige doesn't go until 1971, and then there's a slow kind of drip. We're only going to allow one in a year, and then finally there's a study commissioned by Major League Baseball that takes place, culminates with the admission of Wilkinson and a number of other executives and mostly players in 2006. So there was that kind of big push that took place that led to his induction and that of other very deserving players. But the two Monarchs who ought to be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and I fight hard to get them in, Buck O'Neill, who missed by one vote in this 2006 election. But Buck said in 2006, I'm just so glad that my good friend J.L. got in, because I think he deserved to be in. I don't care about myself, but Wilkinson certainly deserved to be in. Buck said that I've known two men without prejudice in my life. One was my father, and the other was J.L. Wilkinson. So, why did it take so long? I don't know. Inertia. But fortunately, there were a group of very dedicated historians of black baseball. They're a large group. I won't name any because I don't want to leave somebody out. Who kept alive the story of the Negro Leagues and people like J.L. Wilkinson. He's J.L. J. Leslie Wilkinson. The J. His parents said, we're not gonna tell you what the J stands for. You'll have to figure that out. So he never chose. He never chose anything. Although you'll see in records you'll see him called John L. Wilkinson or James L. Wilkinson, but just J.L. His players called him Wilkie.
It sounds like he's almost sort of, the story, his history is almost Hollywood movie quality in some respects. Have you ever been approached or discussed that idea? Is there enough there, do you think?
Contacts?
Well, I mean, this is so some of the things that we've talked about already on this show.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean,
I think so. 42 showed that the story of black baseball, obviously through Jackie Robinson, needs to be told. And there have been several other cinematic attempts. None really too successful. To deal with black baseball, but I'd like to see it. Certainly Rube Foster, but the story of J.L. Wilkinson is fascinating. And although he's a mild-mannered, meek guy, didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't cause problems. A good screenwriter could turn it into a great story, I think.
Yeah, it's never stopped the Hollywood filmmaking machine from attempting that. But again, the influence, right? I mean, we've spent the last hour going through the names and the people and the dynamics that he influenced, and obviously finally, recognizing at least in baseball's Hall of Fame. But I guess we'll put it out there to our listeners. We're about 2 months into this journey.
Well, congratulations on a really great project.
Well, I don't know if there's any congratulations needed, but I am every day surprised at how these stories sort of get disseminated or listened to, and then the response that we get from various people through our various social channels, et cetera. So you never know, and this conversation will live on for many months to come. So perhaps we can stir somebody's interest out there, perhaps in the Hollywood machinery out there.
Can I name the title of the book?
Oh yes, that. Let us do that. Our guest has been Bill Young, and the book is called J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs: Trailblazers in Black Baseball. It is published by McFarland. It is available everywhere books are sold. You'll be able to find a link to it on our website when this show posts.
Great.
And rest assured, Bill, we will plug the book both before and after our little interview here. And I can't thank you enough for joining us and enlightening us on this area of professional baseball. And for what it's worth, you have become the first conversation in the sport of baseball for our little podcast. There's no trophy for that, but we do appreciate it nonetheless.
Sure thing. Well, Tom, keep up the good work. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Bill, my thanks to you. I appreciate it, especially this weekend, and look forward to keeping connected, and hopefully we'll get some more interest around Wilkinson and the story going forward for you. Okay, there you have it. There's our very interesting conversation with author Bill Young. His book, again, is titled J.L. Wilkinson and the Kansas City Monarchs: Trailblazers in Black Baseball. It is published by McFarland. It is available wherever good books are found. You can find a link to the book on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Bill also wrote a book a few years earlier about one of the first Native Americans to star in Major League Baseball. That book is called John Tortoise Chief Myers, a baseball biography, that was published by McFarland in 2012. Again, that is also available where good books are found, and you'll find a link to that book as well on goodseatsstillavailable.com, our website. And in addition to going to our website for all that other good stuff, including the ability to send us some email or sign up for our email newsletter, etc., please indeed follow us on social media. We love your tweets and commentary. It's a great way to keep in touch with what we're doing here on the show and be involved, suggest ideas, etc. On Twitter, that's Good Seats Still. That's at Good Seats Still. That's where you'll find us on Twitter. We're on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. Follow us there. Got some nice imagery and blasts from the past from various photographers and keepers of the photographic flame, shall we say, of sports history. You will find us on Facebook. We have a page there devoted to the show. Just about everywhere you can kind of think of, we're available and out there. So please look for us. Thank you for all your commentary. Thank you for your listenership. Please tell your friends if you like it, and have them listen and download and rate and review and all that kind of good stuff. Until our next show, thank you again for listening, and take care, everybody.